Hello everyone, today we make an hopefully short but at the same time clear point on the demographic and generally economical trend of the Middle Ages in this phase comprehended roughly between high and low medieval Europe that we address several times in Schwerpunkt from because it's basically the same base or the same background for every kind of video we make, generally speaking. When we talk about military history more specifically, we have always to take into consideration what the major political and social transformation of the era really were. Just yesterday, for example, I was talking about the monetization of military service in 13th century Europe. And even though that was very specific, we had to tell about what the whole thing was. But I realized recently I never made an actual point, something that could be didactic or however very simple. I believe that I can't add now much of what my regular followers actually my regular viewers already know because they hear me speaking about it to the nose, yeah. But that it's of equal importance, and this is this very strong. It's fundamentally about this very strong expansion of the European system, let's say broadly meant, that lasted for 3 centuries, right? So this was a major event into the medieval period in general. I can't speak really for other parts of the world because I fundamentally don't know. I believe I believe that this was a major environmental change in some form, not just from a strictly the usual stuff like the climatic point of view, but generally a sort of trend that maybe definitely, yeah, even with climate change, but many other phenomena that had taken place and had put premises fundamentally for it to happen, was developing a bit transversally around at least Eurasia, but I suspect also elsewhere, because if you compare the even closely the say the post-Carolingian world than the Byzantine one or the Islamic one, you realize that there are very similar trends in these directions in the general picture. Then you can still identify major differences, but this is in fact what this it's mainly the differences that have brought to consider this great what we call I think kind of revival or rebirth of European economy. Even here, it's not really clear. You can't give it a general definition. Was it demographics? Was it economic? Was it social? Because there is a huge debate. As a matter of fact, I lean very much towards the idea that there was actually no real progress from a strictly technological or so. I mean, there were definitely many technical developments and let's say a growth and as well as an expansion at this point, but not necessarily and especially in Europe, because also growth and expansion are kind of two very different things. But what are the causes, right? The Vulgata before was the technologistic answer that the new agricultural tools, that's bullshit. Let's be honest about it. There was no relevant technological factor that at this point triggered this growth and its expansion. Technology as always comes as a consequence, right? And also lots of technologies that were used at the time were known already in the ancient world, and also in here you shouldn't even interpret this like, oh well, the Middle Ages up this point hadn't been so backwards that the ancient world was more advanced. No, the ancient world was simply different, and this is not to make a relativistic point, but it's simply to say that if certain techniques had fallen out of use, it's not because the medievals didn't know how to use them, as a matter of fact, because they did it, and without reading about ancient history. As soon as, however, the conditions required them, and the same reason why the ancient kind of lost them, because they weren't required anymore. You can see this all across the board, in not just in agriculture, that it's definitely the most important ground where to look at the story, but also, I don't know, for what interests us more, let's say, subjectively about military history, etc. And you can argue actually that there were several substantial improvements, especially from not much from the moment of expansion proper, but in its contraction, in its decline, because a great that we're gonna look at today, because it was also another great misunderstanding often understood is that technology somehow rockets when there is a great economical expansion or something like that. As a matter of fact, it's the other way around. It's usually when things start to go worse that people need to save to make economy that sharpen their minds and start finding out new solutions that it's not that they effectively lacked the means to figure out before, but they simply didn't have they simply lacked the needs for doing it and invest in it in that field. And that's why when you see this 3 centuries long expansion from roughly the 10th 11th century to the end of the 13th to the mid of the 14th, you see that this is a peculiar character of medieval civilization, is that in spite of the contraction, things kind of started evolving still, and you have towards the late Middle Ages a steady growth that still goes and kind of refine and also improves in quality in many ways, as you understand that the world in the, let's say, in the late Middle Ages was generally more advanced than what it was in the low or in the high one. So in spite of the different rhythms of growth. And we will see now also how the crisis of the late 13th and 14th and mid 14th century was an extremely imposant one, structurally speaking, and it was something that the consequences of which fundamentally lasted way beyond, say, Middle Ages, right? So this was actually not even kind of medieval civilization's fault. Medieval civilization followed this trail of growth that the conditions at the time had allowed. Then things change. There are real, even environmental changes. Just think about the astronomical cycles. It's normal that there are moments in which, I don't know, the weather is colder, is warmer. At this time, we live at the end of a warm period, for example. At the time, there was seemingly a coldening of the climate, just like, and this is how we have explained kind of the not really the cause of the growth that might have possibly been helped also by the climate, but that tendentially today we start saying men tend to expand in general. If there is enough room, right? Yeah, we are kind of like that, but especially this moment of contractions, like the one in the 6th century with Justinian plague, or in mid 14th century with the Black Death, you see that those were massive, solid dramas that were also accompanied seemingly by worsening of the environmental conditions for other reasons, so that in fact we don't consider even the plague or other major pandemic as the cause proper of the collapse, but one of its consequences that obviously brought to kind of made it worse, but that was triggered also in its expansion across the populations as an illness. Because of progressed conditions of, not just because it was cold, but really because the consequence, like the crop rate had declined, the people were now more poorly fed, so their immunitary defenses were lower, and all this stuff. So I don't remember where I was going with this, but just for saying that this phenomena really matter because sometimes they're counterintuitive, and yet they were really what made some of the largest differences at this point as well. So looking a little back on how the growth had begun, we usually identify this period between usually sometimes during the 8th century, especially for what it concerns Central and Southern Europe, and and but safely now from the 10th from the 10th and 11th century throughout all the whole European West, at least. And this was happening also elsewhere, right? So even if you look at the Byzantine Empire, it was something pretty similar. I suspect even the Islamic world, and this is what I now remember what I wanted to say, that there was a growth. We're talking about growth chiefly when we talk about all these areas. Expansion is something else, because you can have a growth but not being able to expand, to take this further, to invest, to create something new. That's where Europe, Western Europe, actually makes a big leap forward into this time. Europe at the beginning of the Middle Ages was fundamentally very backward, especially Central and Northern Europe weren't effectively very developed. They were depopulated. It was a very low population density. The economical potential was what it was. Mostly was about Southern Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East to be the most advanced regions, like it was in the Roman Empire fundamentally. There is a great change at this point, which sees Europe basically taking once again especially through the trade that shifted, especially great quantities of metal, in exchange for this production that Europeans had set for that this whole Western European world starts growing exponentially and expanding, however, which means that it was able to consolidate certain positions, to expand even physically its own boundaries, and to take over those, especially in trade, those sectors that up to that point had been dominated chiefly by the Byzantines and the Arabs. So this was obviously a long-term dynamic that took really a lot of time, but if you look at it in perspective, it's amazing how this growth took place. It's very difficult to quantify that with the means at our disposal in terms of sources and instruments, etc., but it's still remarkable, and it's something that didn't happen in those other worlds that we have talked about, at least for what we know at this point of historiographical research, and that therefore why it has struck our mind, and it was collected, let's say, historiographically, even from times when there was this great faith into progress, into technology, and all these things, like in the 19th century, where it was thought that this was mainly a technological thing, that it was all about, especially recovering stuff from the past, because at that time, the 19th century, people were obsessed by the ancient world, the classical world, that was interpreted like basically the same modern civilization that the Middle Ages had kind of fallen from for some reason. The truth is for what we can grasp, is way different. Like, the Europeans at this point started expanding in ways that not necessarily made them producing more or better, and then not even actually increased the proper quality of their own lives. I mean, this expansion went in parallel with new forms of land exploitation, with different distributions of resources. Think about feudalism, how unequal wealth distribution effectively was, and this thing actually went worse even towards the end of the Middle Ages, where instead you have this growth now, and things go towards this kind of magnificent and progressive world of the modern age, which, however, turns out was in many ways way more oppressive than the Middle Ages had been in terms of political and social dynamics. And this in part also because of the same growth that at one point could not be controlled just by the elites, and broke out, like you see at the end of the modern age in the 18th century with the great bourgeois revolutions. Now, even in there, that they weren't actually people's revolution; they were just the bourgeoisie. So, who cared about the rest of the peasant? Nobody, obviously. But it still was a different world that had now expanded in those structures. So that's how you have to understand the Middle Ages. It wasn't anything like a real progress. Actually, this expansion brought in itself also the seeds for increasing conflicts and more, the increase of even of destructive capabilities, the decentralization, the creation of the feudal monarchies, and their brought to increased capacity of destruction and so on. But at the same time, there were other elements that kind of kept the system dynamic, didn't make it contract like it happened, or at least to stall, crystallize like it happened in the Byzantine world or in the Muslim world. And part of this was probably due to, even though you can't profitably debate it, to the fragmentation of the political picture fundamentally, because this somehow maintained within the same Europe a sort of competition between all the various states that were able even to sectorize the world wealth of the continent, and to make kind of a better use than what a larger overruling empire would have been able to do with a much higher fundamentally not attrition, but dispersion of resources that all big centralized systems at the end of the day are bring to, and that's why China at this time was kind of the most advanced and powerful empire in the world. But still it kind of a couple of not really a couple, but in some centuries would be surpassed dramatically by Europe, even though the Europeans had started with colonialism, etc. But even colonialism was started thanks to the conditions that had been partly settled into the Middle Ages. Actually, in this sectorizational form, actually, the age of exploration starts properly into the Middle Ages. It starts into the 14th century. And it's very interesting to see this, considering that the 14th century was the moment of major contraction. So remember even this ingenuity I was talking to you about before, that didn't bring the system to collapse like it had happened at the end of the ancient era, but it made it to keep rising. So start rebuilding from this massive hemorrhage of resources of lives during Black Death, etc. And if you're interested about this, I made a video called the resilience of medieval civilization, which takes into account this, which is often overlooked. Then instead of thinking like the Middle Ages as a dark kind of motionless world that magically, according to the fantasy of someone, starts growing again because someone read some books by chance, as if, by the way, in the Middle Ages books were not written, read, or studied, or they circulated. And if you look instead of what medieval civilization was able to achieve, was to go straight and keeping to rise, and it was not disrupted as instead was for instance the ancient world was. The ancient world didn't live on in many ways. There was a brutal contraction that brought to a stagnation for not really so many centuries, but early medieval times had a way less smaller kinetic energy of what the ancient world its peak had reached. Well, the Middle Ages maintained always this kinetic energy, and what was set into them, although it's difficult for us to precisely identify the causes, the reasons, kept rising and giving birth to effectively modern age and our progress, as our steady progress, as we mostly understand it, from neglecting what happened in the Middle Ages. That was what effectively put the seeds for it. So, as we were saying before, between the 10th and the 11th century in the European West, a new age of expansion opened, and this was to last for roughly 3 centuries. And this, as we were saying before, it was not just an agricultural phenomenon. It doesn't stop to that. It was an expansion in all the fields of human activity at that point. And this continuous growth of the population was connected naturally with the to the chief, the primary activity that was indeed agricultural production. So the progressive widening of the cultivated areas, and their expansion, and increase in production, quantitatively speaking. And that's what we're talking about before. This is not really a matter of what was now used as a new tool or as a new technique. It was a matter of really expanding physically the boundaries. Even if you look at what triggered this expansion, realize it wasn't really a positive attitude, but sometimes it was maybe just the end of those conditions that had brought to the contraction, that for which people kept making more, or not really necessarily making more children, but having more children surviving because of a better environmental condition. But at the same time, they had to find food now for feeding them, so that people were literally obliged to work if they didn't want to die of hunger. And all of this naturally was also directed by the societies, by the hierarchies. So even when we look at feudalism, like before, and saying, yeah, but it was a kind of an exploitative system, with the rise of feudalism, also the individual freedom kind of deteriorated. It is true, but at the same time, also feudalism as a hierarchical system was able to rationalize the use of feudalism in this sense was capillary enough to be a hierarchy, but still working kind of at a local level. So partially contributing to that sectorization of resources, right? You would have not found in a solid, great empire with a this kind of less attemptive look at the detail in this sense. Instead, the feudal world was very pervasive in this sense, and managed to channel the strengths and resources of the peasantry, of the workers, that otherwise would have not, if they had maintained their own freedom, might have not actually had that clarity of vision and of organizational capabilities that this more stratified society, feudal society, entailed fundamentally. So another very important element to consider is that this process really changed the face of Europe. Like even if you look at the geographical distribution of men and the agrarian landscapes, you realize that the landscape did change. I mean, the Middle Ages at this point is not anymore the wild and medieval Europe. I mean, the wild and kind of primitive and obscure and heavily forested and swampy and area that was especially Central Europe in the north, like it had been since antiquity fundamentally. But now the world starts being populated. Yes, there are massive areas like forested areas, etc. But even forest is populated, is exploited, is taken care of. So this world is expanding beyond limits that before were not known. And now with means of communication and with a sort of homogeneity also of means and practices that allowed this system to be increasingly more interconnected. Like, it sounds a very modern term, but the interconnection. Medieval Europe is interconnected. You can't study medieval Europe thinking of concentrating on isolated chunks of it as if the rest did not exist. Everything worked on the basis of somewhere else, and trade especially starts being a crucial for the economy, for even the structuring of the same political entities of the money that had to be found, etc. And as we often recall, we also made many videos about this, the word very intense. There was also a very intense process of urbanization, right? So urbanization started expanding far beyond what had been the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Another very interesting thing you can understand in here is that, look at the Middle Ages. Were the Romans able to urbanized or colonized places like Germany, etc. Well, no, but the Middle Ages were able to do it. There was this ability of exporting this model, also of Roman origin, definitely, but in many other centers that now had become effectively the centers of planning and of irradiation of goods, of knowledge, of ideas, and that we're creating a new type of society as well. In the meanwhile, with an increased specialization and an ability to move even transversally, that was really putting the basis for what we know now as a European identity, right? Proper, as this was fundamentally unknown in the ancient world. There were other kind of boundaries still of Indo-European origin, but not based on Europe, because this is a very geographical concept now that starts taking shape from the Middle Ages onwards, associated to the European identity. Or better, that is able to develop a European identity as such. There's a revival of monetary economy. We were talking about it just yesterday, as I recalled. Monetary economy fluidified in turn the exchanges. The Middle Ages, you know that I deeply despise with all myself the term revolution. We're talking about the anything in history, but if you look at what happened in the Middle Ages, especially at the banking, monetary level, commercial level, you see now a change that is really radical in its novelty, right? The ancient world, in all its might, etc., had not developed such a strongly commercial and mercantilist and financiary society. The Roman empires, this greater might of finance, etc., had things like the Argentari, for instance, but these were kind of banks with very low rates of interest. Were kind of there was not. The ancient world had a much more stagnant economy. During the Middle Ages, you find a dynamism, and it's the peak of exchange, of mercantilism, of commerce, of trade, and it was all in great part triggered by this kind of monetary, if not revolution, just to be proper, but however a massive change. And now, with the letters of exchange, allowed basically not to literally shift the goods, but basically to make a sort of check of all the movements of with this was pioneered, especially the I don't know how to say that, but all the final payments were summed, and the outcome now just was shifted. So basically, these goods were all these amounts of resources were exchanged way more quickly, way more dynamically, and on this currency that fundamentally the letter of exchange represented, and with money, with the ability of cashing, of obtaining that goods just because you brought a letter, and you could because that's how the banknote is born. That's the banknote. That's how it was born. It was born then. It was born in the ancient world. So where's the great, enormous advancement, progressivistic, modernistic, whatever thing of the ancient world in front of what was happening in the Middle Ages, which in this sense was astonishingly more advanced and more dynamic and more profitable, and brought to a faster expansion. Therefore, there is no comparison between the rhythms of growth of the ancient world and the ones of starting already from the 13th century. So the increase in trade and other even craft and artisanal activities were not industrial ones, in the sense that, of course, we're not talking about the industries of the Industrial Revolution proper, but of methods of production now that were fundamentally of mass production. Think about especially textiles in Europe, in places like Italy, like Flanders. Those were pretty big forms of organizations with thousands and thousands of workers that all produce enormous amounts of this material, of this textiles that were sold pretty much everywhere. The same at this point. Just remember that Europe now is feeding the rest of the Mediterranean. Like in the early Middle Ages is what, but also in the ancient times actually was the other way around. Europe, places like Italy, took food chiefly from places like grain from Tunisia, from Egypt, etc. Now it's like only the grain of Sicily alone that is being exported in places like Tunisia and Egypt. There is an incredible reverse of trade balance that started emerging, in fact, into these very early centuries of the expansions, but was able to not to stop. And the Europeans were to rocket in this sense, because they managed to invest this eventually in this further activities to expand their geographical boundaries, knowledge, and to start through colonialism to capitalize on this, to draw other resources and to reinvest them. So it was extremely, and we know how it ended. So it all started from this point, and it's crucial. It's crucial to identify into the Middle Ages the birth of this system, not in the modern age. In the modern age, it's already started. From some century now. The crucial moment, the crucial century, especially for trade and this banking financial activities, was the 13th. The 13th was, even in there the premises kind of came before, but these new practices now that we mostly attribute to the Middle Ages were started to the modern era, started into the Middle Ages. And what these Italian bankers had found out in the 13th and 14th century basically was not surpassed for centuries to come, because the mechanisms were already set, and also modern banking, modern economy still works on those concepts that were developed at the time without substantial modification. This is amazing, really. So. Thanks, Middle Ages. Naturally, as we were saying before, all of this didn't come without a cost for certain parts of society, of course. So that the let's say the relations of power to medieval society had been shaken by this and reblended in some way, because it had given the financiary and also cultural means actually to surpass the previous seigneurial fragmentation and of the public order that now were being brought under a more central address, fundamentally. So which is particularly interesting because the same fragmentation had not stopped the growth at all. We'll see, as we were saying before, that even at the end of medieval Europe, Europe is pretty much fragmented, politically speaking. So the improvements that are done in a few centuries are definitely amazing. Like, take the 10th century. This is basically the apex of political fragmentation. You have a Europe in which you can barely recognize anything like a kingdom, because everything is so fragmented that every single county basically does something by itself, and still this system had been the one that had given impulse, so that didn't obstacle at all, but on the contrary actually favored these new and very varied experiences that were with those premises definitely led in a very free and very agitated and fashion that um, brought to, in fact, this increasing contrast and competition, and and really a struggle for expansion at this point. So that it wasn't like a progressive thing. It was really a very aggressive and ferocious ability of expansion. Expansion was done through, even wars and conquests and slaughters. I mean, sometimes of an entire populations. Think about, I don't know, the Baltic Crusades or what was happening. It was dramatic in many ways, and the on the economical phase, the expansion, as we said, seems to stop in first decades of the 14th century. This is fundamentally the moment in which we see it. I made a video, especially on the Great Famine of 1315, 1317. That was surrounded also by natural catastrophes, including floods and earthquakes and all this stuff. So we don't know, because sometimes you just read that stuff in the chronicles. You don't understand that whether it's just because, for example, the people began to write more. These are times in which Europe also starts having now a real historical, not really historical, of course, but it starts having a face that is more identifiable. The Europeans start writing increasingly more and massively more, and produce an enormous amount of resources, so that basically between the 12th and 14th century that are just 2 centuries, but effectively they hardly resemble each other, because like if you tell to a medievalist, talk about the 12th century, talk 14th century, they're 2 completely different worlds. The 12th century, still an agrarian world. There are very few sources. We don't know much of what happened. It's all very foggy. In 14th century, you started having an overflow of sources. Basically everything that happened. I mean, everything obviously in relative terms, but still, it's a financiary world. It's all interconnected. You find this strongly this strong financiary dimension. This all took 2 centuries, and with the technological potential that we know. So just thinking how this phenomenon, this expansion had really changed the face of a world with we also talk about literal quantities in here, as we were saying before. It's not just about the quality, because the quality probably didn't change a big deal, but it was what was changing here, what the amount of stuff that you could have more, that before it was impossible even to conceive to have. So it's been incredible, and the pivot of all this had been the primary sector. So it's obvious that the first symptoms even of this actually, let's stop to I was about to say that to explain another thing, that that it's difficult to, however, everything started chiefly with famine. The contraction began chiefly with famines, so that the first symptoms were definitely spotted into agriculture, where you find this even inversion of the trend. It's not just a stall, it's a recession as well. And this seemingly started from the very last decades of the 13th century, and it definitely intensifies in the first decades of the 14th, until the Black Death, that however arrives at a moment where seemingly things had gotten sensibly worse by themselves. I mean, let's be honest about this. It seems as if this system partly exhausted itself. I am starting to believe it wasn't just an environmental thing. It was that this world had it was had an extremely precarious balance in many ways, at least in the political and social forms that it had developed up to this point. In fact, what you see now is that, first of all, one of the major consequences of the growth, of the expansion, had been the emergence of new classes that before didn't count enough anything, so like the commoners, that up to the end of the 13th century start being very, very strong. Like even even if you look at from a military historical perspective, you realize that these European infantries of commoners of between the very end of the 13th and let's say between the 13th and the 14th century were pretty imposing, were pretty strong. After Black Death, it seems they lose much of their power. Europe undergoes a sort of re-feudalization, from which it's effectively now the princes and the monarchs in general that get the the best of and are able to evolve if they're they're capable enough their powers into kind of what the modern state would have become in a completely princely fashion, so that Europe could have had another destiny, and it could have but it would have not necessarily been better or more ordered. It really depends on how you look at that. This contraction in 14th century probably was positive, because just like it had happened at the time of the rise of feudalism, the forces of Europe were now channeled into this kind of princely rule with this monarchical address. And if you look at it in perspective, I mean, it held until the 18th century, which is a pretty long time. So even if we somewhat interpret things like the French Revolution like a story, like a system that was so anachronistic and oppressive, etc., but up to that point it had worked, and it had worked at that point had been working for something like 400 years, or even more. So it's very interesting to even to think at the disciplining factor of social stratification by certain standard, which is perfectly debatable, because of course, but the option that if this contraction had not taken place, and we can't tell whether it was it had to happen at a certain point or not, is it doesn't there was still an option that things could go otherwise, right? And it's difficult to tell whether this had to happen, or it just happened for kind of external reasons, or at least from certain choices that were taken, certain directions that were chosen actively by. But it was a mix of factors, of course, from both directions. And what you see, in fact, after the 14th century, however, is a great depression. It's not just a contraction, as we were saying before. The European system keeps growing, but it does it now having absorbed a very hard hit, a very hard blow. And it would take, like, if you look at European cities at the beginning of the 14th century, well, some of them wouldn't recover their population until like the 17th century, the 18th century. So this tells you even dimensionally how hard this blow had been, and that's why this depression is chiefly economical, was protracted beyond the limit with which we traditionally make the Middle Ages ending. This contraction, this depression, however, isn't to be meant as, in fact, as we have observed, as a stop of the growth at all, not at all. But what if the European system kept growing, but it definitely didn't go at the same speed it had gone before. Like this difference in potential you see between centuries like the 11th and the 14th, it's something that even during the modern age you don't see growing in proportion at the same time. Obviously, the system developed, and the bigger it was, and naturally, the more quantitatively it grew. But in relative terms, it was still never at the same speed in proportion than it had happened in those central centuries of the Middle Ages. So this is particularly important to see in a perspective, because it makes you reflect even on the sustainability of a prolonged growth without control. I don't think that this is something so anecdotal that cannot find other applications, because I believe that we live exactly in a very similar time to what had been the very beginning of the 14th century. I don't think that there will be a major fall. I think there are very different premises, of course, but it's more reflecting about the boom, right? The thing about the boomer generations. It's something very similar to what happened in those 12th, 13th centuries. An immense growth. That is growth that has not been channeled effectively under a directory society. Like the second half of the 20th century was the age of the democracy, of liberalism, of this increase of average per capita wealth. Not to make you confused, let's say that before we were saying that throughout all the Middle Ages there was this contraction in freedom, yes, but it happened also on different levels. Like there were classes that now were growing, and they were growing to kind of dominate on others, even in parallel to feudalism. So that Europe is not just feudalism. That's why we talk to the nausea also about urbanization and the communal dimension, because that is something that developed itself in parallel with feudalism. And at the end of the Middle Ages, they were shoulder to shoulder in, for instance, oppressing the peasantry. In that instead didn't make it, because the peasantry was also extremely aggressive, extremely ferocious, and it had this however this need of expanding, of rising. There might have been a fourth state during the Ancien regime, represented by the peasantry. The peasantry lost their battle at the end of the Middle Ages. They expanded their strengths, they had the potential, but they weren't organized at all. They were unaware of their situation, they were short-sighted, they didn't realize what they could do. They could make this extremely violent revolts, even at the same time, because this was these revolts were all kind of systemically triggered in part, but they broke out in many places at once, but they weren't they weren't really communicating much the one with the other. So they basically the feudal system and the cities managed to choke them and to repress them in a proportionally violent way. But the boom generation is still a good example to show you how at this point there's been a contraction with since of course 9/11. Then there is the major crisis of the second half of the 200s, the first decade of 200s. We also still don't fare particularly well. Well, it's pretty similar to what was happening with the beginning of the 14th century, right? Obviously with very different premises, with very different dynamics. But just for saying that a society at a certain point is first of all it's tendentially not made to grow unlimitedly, because still we don't live even in a physical world in which this is possible. I'm not talking about our actual potentials of expansion. It's really a tendency, an intrinsic tendency of mankind to seize when they can, but to grow lazy once they have seized that, and not having developing after that the ingenuity that brought that same ingenuity, or beyond the ingenuity that they used to seize that thing they could seize. And therefore, that's why we at this moment in history seems to be there a lack of commitment, a lack of resourcefulness, of ability to think through, and it seems also passive and stagnating and recessing, because it's still part of a broader collective phenomenon that affects it's not just a structural problem, because the structural problem is it's very evident. I mean, we knew since the 50s that there would have been in this time more or less an economical contraction, that this was studied and known by the old economists. What is more worrying, and as we still live in the best way we've ever done, historically speaking, but there is a moral bankruptcy that is even more astonishing, because we lack the moral resources at this point, and because we grow disenchanted, we're not hungry anymore, we're not motivated, therefore. So it's a great problem. It will be probably, now we're still struggling to figure it out. I believe it will be the great topic of the 21st century in perspective, especially in the second half of the 21st century. It will have to, we will have to find a solution with that, and probably by that we will know much better ourselves also as a society, and we will, probably be able to have the instruments to take better decisions, because at this time the system is effectively falling apart in some ways in terms of moral commitment. Structurally is really not. We are still able to keep it together, but we will pay the consequences of our moral bankruptcy in a much more imposing way now. In those times it was the other way around. In those times it was effectively a pretty big structural collapse. And in fact what happened and saved that civilization was the moral reaction that was entailed. The 14th century is a century in which, in my opinion, there was a brutal acceleration of rationalization, of secularization, in part, in the sense that there was the decline of the papacy, of the empire. There was this moment of great disenchantment for sure, but at the same time it was a world that triggered things like humanism, like the Renaissance. So a new way of thinking things orthodoxly, squared, in a squared way, and to try to find a solution on a kind of a scientific base, and they had that reaction. I don't know if we will, if we're gonna have that reaction, because it seems that also things are way more difficult to ascertain. Those people perceived the lack. If you live in a world where from a day to another 1/3 of the population disappears because it's taken away by the Black Death, you're gonna pose yourself so many questions, so many problems. You're gonna put into discussion the whole thing that up to that point had given you so much hubris, so much happiness, so much trust in the future. There are darker views of the world that emerge, in fact, as well, but at the same time they're in this sense more realistic, that people were more warned towards the bad things that could happen. So I think it's interesting even to draw these parallelisms, because otherwise you may wonder what we hear about such changes. Of course, I personally am not an expert about these topics in general, but I think that there are many useful things we can learn from those times, that very far from being history repeating itself the way it happened, it's still pretty useful for us to find new answers about our own world, and find new/old answers to what is happening into our world, into our society, that can be of use for anyone. So that's particularly important. And this is more or less what I wanted to say, and I wouldn't like to add anything else. It's pretty obvious that we will keep talking about lots of things about this. We will have to address all these topics, looking at the various sectors, like because in economy certain things happened, in demographics certain things happened. We have to look at them one by one, but it's still important to frame this this thing macro-dimensionally, because this transformation, at least macro-dimensionally, because there is a lot of kind of relativism surrounding this stuff. That's also why I make this comparison with the ancient world and all that, because even people who have a decent interest in commitment into history, etc., still have difficulties to figure out such things like what that the Middle Ages obviously objectively wasn't a dark period at all, and that also the comparison with the ancient world is not very sensed, and very often it's grossly unbalanced and BS fashion towards the ancient world, just because I don't know what, because the classical times look cooler. What's the point you're making? And because I personally think that the Middle Ages were a way better time, and the points that are added in here are very relativistic, like it's taking just one little thing at a time, saying, I don't know, the medievals didn't have aqueducts. That's not the answer. You have to look at what the medieval was to answer why they didn't have aqueducts, but still look at the improvements in other fields of metallurgy, within other knowledge, the ability of the synthesis, that and the intellectual vivacity, and many other things that are not just material conquests. I mean, technical conquests, scientifical, yes, but in this sense also ideal conquests, like theoretical conquests, intellectual achievements, right? That were able, that allowed to give a better order to society, to give a much better commitment. We would be shocked I believe, to think how much the ancient world was actually very not contemplative of itself. It was the medieval society was extremely attentive towards it. It's in this sense way more similar to us than the ancient world. You start reading chronicles from the 14th century, you barely can understand that this stuff was written, in fact, 700 years ago. For the ancient world, you studied just some authors, some Greek ones, and you resemble yourself into that, saying this guy thinks like me, but that was an ultra elite in terms of, and even an anomaly in what the ancient world was on average in terms of mindset, etc. So it's particularly important to grow closer to the Middle Ages, because they weren't at all such a far distant time, and we're way more medieval still today than what we are prone to believe, actually. And yeah, probably the Middle Ages, we still live in the Middle Ages, I believe, in terms of the period that exercised the greatest influence on especially in our mindset in general. I think it's that one. I'm not exaggerating. Maybe not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, definitely. I believe that there is no comparison. I don't think the modern age has influenced us as much as the Middle Ages did. Not the contemporary age. With the ancient world is a bit of a clash, I believe, but it's still understanding that everything emerged from lots of things blended together, and that there are not these staged moments in these moments in history in which there is a stage and then another one, but it's still the same trail, let's say, evolving in itself. So whatever, for now it's enough, and as always, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I don't remember what I say usually. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.